God help us all.
Who is Justin Fair? Who are you?
Iraq, Iran. A Parable. By Alan R. Austin. This is a parable about the Iraq War. Russia, China, Cuba, Iran, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea, the US, and others in ongoing partisan cultural and political conflicts. These countries and many others have actively inhibited the common-sense discourse of moral integrity, ethics, and dignity among nations and with each other. Solutions exist, but there will always be a need for law and order, a criminal justice system, and honest transparency with cooperative verification. Yes, there is excessive intolerant radical religious zealotry by Islamic, Jewish, and Christian. That is a huge part of the problem. We can all work for peace by first being insightful and deliberately considerate in our choices and actions each and every day. So let us build bridges, fences, and walls we can trust whenever possible. Trust with verification, law, and order. Once there was a blind man who walked the same path every day and stubbed his toe on the same rock in the path every time he passed. There are signs in the path warning all the pedestrians to avoid the rock, but the blind man couldn't see them. After complaining loudly, someone responded to help the blind man by putting in a rotating speaker message. The looped message warned of the rock and its potential problems. Those who came close could easily hear it. Eventually, some noticed that the blind man is also deaf or cannot understand the clearly stated message. The blind/deaf man continued to complain in his pain that there was no plan for the rock. Everyone agrees that the rock is a serious problem and many good plans to deal with it had been offered. The government does not directly help fix the rock problem. Frustration was encountered in association with the inept and clueless government. The wise elders thought about how they can help the blind man and solve the rock problem. They suggest that the blind man remove his dark sunglasses and earplugs. It was a communication problem. The community tried to tell him and show him how to remove the barriers to his senses, and it appears to be a long, hard task. Some had given up on the blind man completely and believed that if he chooses to stub his toes and then cry endlessly, then that must be his own chosen fate. Others thought that the blind/deaf man could see and hear only those things he chooses because he likes to complain. He did not take any responsibility for his questionable behavior. One day the people voted for new representatives of the government in the hope that the rock problem will eventually be solved. Some sensible voices arose above the din of malcontent fervor when new representatives were elected. The previously offered plans can be fine-tuned and implemented. A heavily fortified fence constraining a substantial area was built around the rock, and more speakers and warning signs were to be constructed. A new government approach helped guide any lost souls away from the hazards of such a dangerous toe-stubbing rock. Eventually, most of the town people were resigned to leave the whole rock territory alone. The blind/deaf man learned of the new fence and complained loudly that the fence was in his way. Some pathological people learn slowly. Others, like the one in the story, had problems with their abilities to see and hear clearly. These persons also had antisocial tendencies that cause many problems with themselves and innocent others. Some were creating chaos and confusion in the communities where cooperation was valued as a virtue and not as a forced obligation. Faced with the blindness and deafness as a contributing factor for hostile actions, the more sycophantic persons were confined to very limited spaces. Since the prisons and mental institutions were full, a revised plan called for new construction of a compound to be built directly over the problematic rock. The blind/deaf man and others like him were allowed to live there but were not allowed outside the fence. Many of the villagers forgot about the rock and the prison compound. Ultimately, the captives had to deal with their own issues by making the gated area intentionally self-sufficient. Some prisoners began to make items for trade with the outside world. They put up signs of fair trade at fair prices on the locked exterior gate. Curious patrons came to barter with guarded optimism. Over time, the villagers noticed that graves were present within the gated community. Responses were made to their inquiries, but the replies did not make much sense. The villagers were told that one blind/deaf man wanted to be the dominant leader, so some prisoners had to fall to prove the resolve of his power. Others had died to thwart the leader's efforts to dominate the territory. These liberators were buried alongside those loyal to the dictator. Blood had drenched the soil, creating a foul odor in the air. One day a large commotion with screams of pain and anger arose from within the fenced compound. The community came to see what had occurred. How could anyone stop the unbridled lawlessness and apparently massive cruelty? The non-blinded prisoners had actually lost their sight. Those who were not deaf before had actually lost their hearing. Those who were initially both deaf and blind were at the mercy of all others. They were stoned to death as gross ignorance met with intolerant violence. The community was aghast at the inhumanity within the prison walls. The wiser ones knew that the blind/deaf community had not learned their lessons of civility, cooperation, and respect for others. Common sense and courtesy were lost in the mix of hostility and limitation. A few brave but foolhardy souls climbed over the fence to offer aid, but they too were stoned by ignorance and hatred. A group of compassionate citizens gathered food, water, and clothing to help those trapped within the prison walls. The community was spared the violence that happened within the prison walls. Indirectly, every citizen was at a loss. There was at least one area of agreement. This is it. You can complain about a path that is given or chosen, but each person has the means to alter the path to some degree. The adjustment in the path might avoid the possibility of stubbing your toe continually over an obstacle that seems virtually immovable. 1. You can choose your path around a rock if you fear to confront its danger directly. 2. You can seemingly courageously step well over that rock if there is no good alternative. 3. You can stand immobilized and be indecisive at the base of a rock while fearing you might stub your toe. 4. You might even kick at the rock while complaining that the rock is allowed to exist at all. 5. You might try to blast away at the rock until it broke far beyond recognition. 6. Some options are limited by creative imagination and desire for resolution. Only foolish blind/deaf man would take some of these choices. What is your choice?